1. Prologue, Chapter 1, Parts 1 to 3. Disclaimer: I do not own any of the Warhammer 40K games, books, or movies. They belong to their creators and/or copyright owners. I make no money from this story. It is not for sale or rent. Anne, this part was baited by Salarius on the Sufficient Velocity forums. Thank you very much for the time and effort you put in cleaning up this story. A Tale of Blood and Steel. Prologue, Monsters in the Dark. Ah, you're awake. Good, good. Just in time. A voice swinging from a mouth-watering contralto to a pleasant bass whispered in my ear. It sent shivers of pleasure and revulsion down my spine, yet it froze the blood in my veins. He's just a little terrified human. A deep, chilling voice rumbled from all around me. It felt like bloodthirst, rage, and war. It made my blood race like a battle hymn. My heart thundered with the need to rip and tear, to bathe myself in the blood of my enemies. I opened my eyes and immediately wanted to claw them out of my skull, yet I was unable to move, to look away. The landscape, it was hard, no impossible to describe. There were fleshly, half-rotted mouths on the floor ceiling. Men, women, and children, who were little more than slabs of brutalized flesh and offal, were being tortured in unspeakable ways. Their screams of agony, ecstasy, were echoing in the purple, pulsating void all around us. Directions were shifting in a way that simply made no sense. Up and right, left and down. Chuck percent, HRF, tabcent. What did you do, Birdbrain? Another male spoke. The voice sounded like decay, like the moans of the deathly sick. This wasn't according to plan. Another voice, inhuman, wise, amused, interested. It constantly changed in tone and timbre. It held the promise of things to come. You think? This was different. The voice made my very soul ring with confidence I've never known. It held calm radiance, filing my heart with hope. How amusing! A shard of the corpse emperor. The male-female thing laughed from behind me, the very substance of the sound making me flush with desire. He's one of mine, the bright voice spoke, disregarding the interruption. Yours? No. A flutter of feathers, many bird-like eyes formed in the twisting madness around me and staring into my soul. Then he isn't one of yours either. The light sounded amused. Not yet. The voice was all feminine, soothing, seductive, arousing. Its sheer presence made me scream as my mind was bombarded with visions of carnal pleasures that no sane man would ever dream of in his deepest nightmares. Don't break it yet. The constantly changing voice admonished, while the 1,000 eyes continued to stare into me. Wrong. This exactly by de plan. A large, very green face suddenly appeared in front of me and grinned. Those were some huge and eerily sharp teeth. That just what you get? The green being winked at me. You. The flutter of feathers was getting irritated, though even more interested. We is bored. Another even more green face simply materialized next to the first. "'Tay 1,000 years the same staff," it grumbled. The twisting madness around the faces started turning green. "You want Chanji?" The ever-changing voice had a distinct tone this time. It was amused, satisfied, curious. "Fun. We want a fun." The two green monstrosities roared as one. The 13th was boring. Something muttered, "Occur, ta percent." "Car. See." That made my mind hurt. "We want a new game," the faces chanted again and again. "What do you expect just an ordinary man from wherever you got him to do?" The only voice I could relate to spoke in a long, suffered tone. "Dat. Unexpected. His flesh is weak, his will is brittle." I could hear the echo of a battle in the voice. "I can fix that." The sound of tongue-wetting lips followed the seductive wiseper. The promise of... I shuddered in more pleasure than a human should be able to ever feel. He's still a human, and alive. There was a wonder as warm light brushed over me. The 1,000 eyes staring at me crinkled, smiling. Yes. The voice was all sex and lust. Amusement rolled from her, him, it. "What say you, little morsel? Ready to play?" "Don't answer." The light became harsh, searing the yes off my tongue. "Game's afoot." The first green face beamed at me. "Wah!" His joyful scream washed over me. Reality itself shifted, snapping into focus. My mind suddenly cleared, allowing me to comprehend where exactly I was. If my body wasn't frozen, I would have voided my bowels then and there, before screaming like a little girl and fainting. None of that was allowed. "We have a proposition for you." The sensual voice slid over my body like a lover's caress, making me shudder in delight. "Choose a boon and be on its way." That was more akin to the roar of chainsaws than a voice. I awoke with a startled gasp and looked around. Small, stuffy room, pitch dark. I could hear the soft whine of a servo skull. It felt familiar, reassuring. Letting a sigh of relief, I closed my eyes and fell back in the bed. It was that dream again, though there were a few more details this time. I shuddered as a vivid recollection ran through my mind. Even whispering a word about what I often dream of would be enough to see me summarily executed if I was lucky. I should know, I've been training to be an Inquisitor for what felt forever. That was mostly true too. My first memories were awakening in a tiny, empty cell in what I later found out to be one of the Holy Black Ships. Let me tell you, the journey to the most holy terror was rather unpleasant, especially when I simply couldn't remember who I was or how I got there. Then I found out that I didn't know the meaning of the word unpleasant, or what agony was for that matter, not until I found myself securely strapped to a gurney while a robed abomination that was more machine than man shoved a piece of rubber in my mouth, ordering me to bite down. Then he was out and something shifted around me, letting me get a good look of the place where I woke up. I had mere moments to stare in horror at the dozens of very sharp, very long needles pointed all over me, before the torture implements descended and all I knew was pain. I know I lost consciousness soon thereafter as the agony became too much for my mind to bear. That was also the first time I had the bloody nightmare. When I regained consciousness, I was informed of what was expected of me. I had to train my cursed powers and use them in the name of the God Emperor of mankind. Or I could get shot then and there if I was lucky. I shook my head at the memory. It sucked. There was nothing else to say about it. The fucking pain was bad enough. The little fact that it heralded me being able to touch what was literally hell for the first time I could remember was so much worse. I shuddered. The mere thought chased off what little vestiges of sleep I had left. I threw the blanket away and stood up. "Light up," I ordered. The servo skull obeyed the voice command. A quiet click came from it. A subdued whoosh followed, and the crown-shaped basket it wore, like a hat, was filled with flickering orange flames. I took a deep breath of the sweet incense. The simple familiarity of the smell made me feel a bit better. The dancing flames illuminated my home for the past half-decade, since my soul was bound to the Emperor and I was sent back to the Skulla. My meager possessions were carefully arranged around the room. That was the stormtrooper sergeant's fault. He who enforced discipline and made sure that we all were presentable all the time, because he wouldn't tolerate anything less. We were on the third such fella ever since I was volunteered for this particular school. The last two suffered rather gruesome and inventive accidents after pissing off a few of my fellow students too much. That bit of fun was swiftly followed by inquisitorial type of justice. It was ever more bloody, long-lasting and gruesome than what my scholar mates could ever think about. The first accident actually made the smarter of us think. It became obvious why most of our cadre weren't psychers. They were a test of a sort to see how would we act towards them when pushed. When someone went overboard, well, at least we got break from classes on the next day and a bit of free entertainment. That also served as additional motivation to study hard and learn how to safeguard our thoughts better. After all, an open mind was like a fortress, with its gates opened and sign in orbit inviting various unpleasant types, as Master Hughes used to say, before he got eaten by a demon in class, the poor sod. Fortunately, I missed that bit of excitement, because anyone in the same wing of the building had to go very strict screening by the Ordo Malleus folks who were here to teach us, while doing some R&R, and a whole third of the people in there were never seen again, though soon we had an upswing in servitors on campus. Totally unrelated, I mean it. When an honest, Emperor-blessed Inquisitor says so, it becomes a divine truth, one that no one sane is going to naysay. I smiled at the good times I remembered and returned my attention to the present. What little I possessed was packed up in a single cargo container which lay open in the middle of the room. Mostly it held a few changes of clothes, courtesy of the small stipend the students without any other source of income received for expenses. They served as an additional packaging for the most expensive thing I owned. A couple of heavy leather-bound books covered with blessed seals. They contained various litanies and blessings which should protect a careful psyker when practicing his warpcraft or facing such a phenomena. Besides that, all I had was my issued gear, which didn't amount to much because of who I was, a no-one who lacked a family or any other support structure to help pave my way. So instead of something more functional, I had to relegate myself to a standard-issue carapace armor, a las pistol, and an old scarred chainsword. Then there were the most important things that, while technically mine, were actually owned by the Holy Inquisition. Those were my credentials, papers that would let me board a warp-capable transport to Kronus, in the Zeus system, Lithesh sector, and the small blessed sigil signifying that I was working for an Inquisitor. One I haven't yet met, though that wasn't really a surprise. Usually the neonates like myself, once we were deemed sufficiently trained that we could be of some minor use before we got ourselves killed, were sent to meet the Inquisitor under whom we were supposed to apprentice and really start learning the ropes. I glanced at the data slate containing my orders and stilled as a shiver ran up my spine. For some reason, every time I thought about Kronus, I felt unease. My few attempts to divine that was all about were unsuccessful, giving me only vague portents of danger. That was decidedly unhelpful. I would be meeting my master while he was at work over there, something that virtually guaranteed danger. Shaking my head at the worry, I tore my sight from the cargo crate and checked up the time. It was 4 in the morning, about an hour or so before I should have gotten up to ensure my arrival at the spaceport would be in time. That left me to check up if everything was packed at my leisure, seal the crate and take a shower. Once that was done, I got into one of my 2 pair of decent clothes, strapped the armor on, and pocketed my credentials and orders. Knowing my schoolmates, leaving something really valuable in my rooms unattended wasn't a smart thing to do on the day I was to finally leave this place. It was time to properly adjust the caf to blood content in my veins. Chapter 1. Welcome to the Inquisition. Part 1. Munitorum Warp Transport Blood of Saints. En route to Kronus. Zeus system. Lithesh sector. 2 weeks in warp transit. It frayed my nerves and shook my mind. The source of my power, so close, so enticing. I had to spend all my time on board in prayer, reciting litanies while going over the mental exercise to center myself. This was much worse than my only other warp travel after my binding, which brought me to the scholar. During that little excursion, the Imperial was very calm in contrast to the turbulent travel I had to endure this time around. By the time we emerged at the edge of the system, the Geller fields were straining, and the unintelligible whispers I'd been hearing in the last days of our transits were getting more and more vocal. So it's not a surprise that I felt a huge surge of relief when we were back in normal space. I should have known better then, though at the time I was more interested in catching up with some sorely missing sleep to think how the universe planned to screw me over. Once I was awake and managed to drag myself to the mess hall, I was still downing my first cup of steaming caf when a naval armsman bursted in. "Sir, the captain requests your presence at the bridge." The sergeant gave me a proper salute. "At your earliest convenience." In turn, I rewarded him with a bleary-eyed glance that would have made a plague zombie proud and finished my cup. I didn't need to touch the warp to feel the fear oozing from him. My status as a very new, very green inquisitorial agent might have had something to do with that. Though personally, I think it was a more mundane reason. A symbol on my coat designated me as a psyker, so everyone and their uncle should know who to shoot in case of warp shenanigans. When you took those 2 things into account, you can guess why I was left alone during the transit, though coincidentally there was a heavily armed detachment of naval armsmen stationed near my chambers. That was the Navy speak for right fucking now, right? I groaned and looked forlornly at the kitchens where the cooks were busy preparing lunch. Nah, appearing in front of the ship's master with a cup of caf, unless it was for him, won't fly. As far as someone working for the Inquisition, I was near the bottom of the food chain and currently had no real authority of my own. Something that Captain Linux was well aware of. He's been carting passengers such as me for a long, long time. Now that the caffeine was kicking in and my brain was starting to work properly, I had to stop myself from groaning and tarnishing my non-existent reputation. The captain wasn't calling me, so I could watch us approaching the planet from the bridge. I wasn't important enough to warrant such a privilege. Someone of my station would need to be a scion of a rather powerful noble dynasty, famous military family or something like that, to earn a visit by the shipmaster. I stood up, straightened up my clothes and waved at the sergeant. By all means, lead the way. I haven't had the honor of visiting the bridge. The NCO looked indecisive for a moment. He was obviously reluctant to let me walk behind him. I gave him a flat look and walked next to him. I have no real idea where's the bridge without scrying for the place. That's something both of us would rather avoid, I think. The casual mention of warpcraft made him pale, his hands crossed in the warding sign of the Aquila. Let's not keep the captain waiting. I walked towards the entrance I came from. Ah, sir, this way. The sergeant cleared his throat and pointed at the door in the far end of the mess hall. My mood was already in a free fall when we reached the bridge. There were a lot of naval rats doing their job, and a few cogheads whistling in binary and waving smoking incense with their maker tendrils. Most notable and concerning were the three people looking at a hollow projection of the Zeus system. The one in the middle was the most physically imposing, towering a head taller than the rest. He wore a purple trench coat with ridiculous parade pauldrons on the shoulders. Bald head with visible implants and data jacks was all I could see from this angle. To his left stood a short woman in a reasonably plain uniform, which fit her like a glove. I admit, I stared at her curves for a few moments before my eyes snapped to the third person. Even with my warp sense shut, as I've kept it ever since the journey started, I could feel the power of the man. If I had to guess, he was our navigator. The woman was probably either the CO or the commander of the naval arms men. That didn't bode well. Agent Vale, you join us at last. The navigator's voice boomed. I gave him a respectful bow. It never hurt to be polite to a potentially more powerful psyker, not to mention one who was undoubtedly much more experienced than me. We have a problem. The captain's gruff voice made me redirect my attention. The man had turned towards me, revealing a burnt face that was mostly bionics. How can I be of assistance, sir? I asked politely. We've had some communication problems ever since transiting to real space. They were fixed an hour ago and we got a sit rep. The woman turned around, revealing a weathered face that once had held stunning beauty. Now it was a mess of scars which she wore proudly. It's rather interesting, I take it. Kronus is a mess. Besides the damn Tau, we've got Orcs and Eldar down there. They've been giving hell to the Imperial Guard. The woman smiled thinly. The good news is that we've got an Adeptus Astrates strike cruiser in orbit. It emerged from behind the planet a few minutes ago. That's not as good as it should sound, I tried. We've also have conflicting reports stating that there have been at least 2 engagements between elements of the Guard and the Blood Ravens, who own the cruiser. Well, fuck. My false good cheer died a sudden and violent death. Do you know something about this spirited situation? The captain made a grimace, which might have been a smile. It was impossible to tell. All I know is that I'm supposed to meet with Inquisitor Requista on my arrival planetside. I shrugged. Captain Linux gave me his version of disappointed look. We've also received instructions to ferry you to Victory Bay as soon as practical. We received an encoded message for you too. The woman who lacked a name tag on her uniform gave me a data slate. I see. Have arrangements for my departure been made? Your luggage should already be in the shuttle. You're leaving in an hour. The woman stated blandly. I see. Thank you, ma'am. Captain Linux, it's been a pleasure. I gave them a proper bow and saw myself out. 30 minutes later, I was strapped into the back of an ancient shuttle, which took off a couple of minutes after I went on board. Whoever had requested my presence had obviously lit up a fire under the captain's command throne. Not good at all. At least I was alone in the small passenger compartment, which let me free to see the message. I used my sigil, which was actually an artifact full with codes and ciphers to decode the data. My eyes skimmed over the titles of Inquisitor Jonas Requista, Ordo Xenos until I reached the important part. It was succinct and to the point. The Blood Ravens and the Imperial Guard had conflicting orders, something that might prove troublesome. I was to go visit Governor General Alexander and fix the mess before it got out of hand, while my master and his retinue were busy investigating heretic activity on the Deimos Peninsula. They were expected to be out of contact for some time. Obviously, that message had been recorded before the shit hit the fan and the Emperor's finest started shooting each other. The only bright thing in sight was the last few sentences of the message. They were in High Gothic and meant that in this instance I was to act in the name of the Lord Inquisitor, something that at least in theory gave me a bit of power. Well, fuck me. If the Imperial Guard and the Space Marines were shooting at each other, my newfound authority was unlikely to impress them while Requista and company were out of contact. Damn it all to the warp. I was fresh out of the Schola. I wasn't supposed to be dealing with generals and astrates. I was so fucked. Part 2. Spaceport, Victory Bay, Kronus. Once I was able to stop bemoaning my fuck-all luck and likely immediate demise, I had a few hours to start scheming. Without an actual Inquisitor around who could simply order this whole fucking mess stopped, I would need to get creative. Considering that I really knew very little about the situation, besides what amounted to rumors, meant that I needed some facts and to talk with the general. Persuading him to stop trying to force the IG on Kronus in mass suicide by astrates would be a good first step after that. If that didn't work, I would be in a bind. Technically, I might be in my rights to shoot him then, though that wouldn't be a course of action that would be survivable. For some arcane reason, I was quite taken with my continued state of living, so that was flat out. Our atmospheric entry and landing went without a hitch, and soon enough the ramp opened, revealing a brightly lit landing pad. I looked around. The place was rather busy, but it paled in comparison with the port at Omnicron Phi, the location of my Schola and the only place I could call home until I was promptly kicked out into the outright terrifying world that was this millennium. There were a lot of dock worker, heavy machinery, the inevitable cogheads and soldiers milling around either doing their work or trying to skive off a few minutes of rest. A squad of the latter waited leaning on a chimera next to the steps leading down from the landing pad below me. Obviously, they were here for me, because one of them, an NCO, started striding up the steps once I got out into the sun. "Sir, I'm Sergeant Lacroix, Alpha Platoon, Baker Company, 71st Battalion, 1st Kronus Regiment. Are you Agent Vale, from His Majesty's Inquisition, sir?" "I'm an inquisitorial agent, yes." I nodded at the sergeant. "We're to escort you to see the general, sir." "Splendid. Just a moment." I took a deep breath and let my mental barriers ease up a tiny bit. Touching the warp was both exhilarating and revolting. The sheer raw power at one's command was only surpassed by the perils that laid in wait over there. This time was much worse than usual. The warp here was akin a boiling cauldron, just needing a push to explode into violence. That didn't bode well for anyone. I sent a prayer to the Emperor on Holy Terror that Inquisitor Requista would be successful in his heretic hunt before the imbeciles could do something particularly idiotic and doom us all. I touched a tiny fraction of the power the warp freely offered me, using it to pick up my cargo container and make it float after me. That was an obvious power play, intended to rattle the guardsmen a bit before I started questioning them during our ride to meet the brass. At the moment they were my best and only source of information, and I was going to ruthlessly milk that, mind-screwing included. As expected, none of the soldiers were particularly happy at my mostly harmless display of witchcraft. It got them nervous, on edge. "Shall we go?" I beamed at the guardsmen, who were throwing uneasy glances at the cargo crate floating behind me. They reluctantly piled into the chimera, which had an auto-cannon mounted on top, and I followed suit. Once inside, I lowered my luggage to the ground and took a free seat. "How's the situation around here?" While making my way planet-side, I heard some concerning rumors. The troopers looked at each other and hastily shook their heads. "No idea, sir. We just do what we're ordered to." Lacroix shrugged. "To tell you the truth, my time in the Schola didn't make me a silver-tongued devil. They were too busy teaching us how to literally tear thoughts from people's minds or effective interrogation methods, which was Inquisition speak for how to torture people while keeping them alive so we could actually learn something. Actually being nice and persuasive, that wasn't something they taught. Such things were apparently mere superstition and never worked. At least that's what Inquisitor Gregory Foch believed, and he was the one who taught us how to untangle reluctant tongues. Besides, anyone who didn't start singing about any sins he thought might be perpetrated by a person he either knew or heard about was supposedly an obvious heretic who needed to be questioned. I took those lessons with a grain of salt, but made sure that Foch thought me to be a very attentive student who agreed with his methods. Of course I did. I had no desire to be a volunteer like Claudia after mounting off to the Inquisitor. Last I heard the Medicae were finally putting her back together, and she might return to school in a year or so. Fortunately for her, she was a scion of a minor noble house, and they were able to pay for the expensive treatment. Anyone with less wealth and connections would have received the Emperor's mercy if they were lucky. But I digress. I had a squad of soldiers to grill about the mess I had unwittingly landed myself in. I gave them a disarming smile while I delved a bit deeper in the warp. Their very souls shone around me with the dull light of the Empyrean blind majority of the population. I focused on the people around them and laced my voice with intention and power. The overall situation, Sergeant Lacroix. Give me a summary. Tell me about the issues with the Blood Ravens too. The NCO stiffened and his eyes glazed. The rest of the guardsmen shrunk back from us. I could sense the fear radiating out of them. It was tasty. It's an Emperor-damned mess, Lacroix sneered. We were sent here to recover this world from the Tau and the local bloody Xeno lovers. We took this city with light casualties. Before we could even properly set up FOB and depots, the damn knife-ears started raiding our rear areas. Then the fucking orcs landed, and the Eldar had been funneling them our way ever since. Meanwhile, the damned blue-skins had been taking potshots at everyone, and they're keen on retaking Victory Bay and kicking us off this rock. It's only thanks to the General we've been able not only to hold our positions, but retake the farmlands beyond the city limits. The sergeant paused to take a deep breath. When the Astrates arrived last week, we thought that it was Emperor's blessing. Instead, they demanded that we leave the planet and evacuate the populace. The General refused because he has orders from up high to secure this planet. In the last 3 days, the Astrates wiped out 2 companies in the farmlands, and I heard we've shelled one of their forward outposts. It's a fucking damned mess. Lacroix shook his head in disgust. What about the Inquisitor Requista? I asked. He was here a few days before the Astrates arrived, took a stormtrooper platoon, his retinue, and went hunting heretics. I hope he'll get the fucking traitors. Well, wasn't that just peachy? Apparently the problem wasn't with the IG, and instead the Space Marines were feeling unreasonable today. I was certain that the General would want me to fix that mess, though I simply lacked the authority to even suggest a course of action to the Astrates. Yet I would probably have to do so anyway, and hope not to get a bolt around to the head for my trouble. Joy. Part 3. Victory Bay, Kronus. We were barely halfway to the main Imperial Guard base in the city where General Lucas Alexander was lurking, when the troopers finished apprising me of the situation. On the bright side, with the arrival of Blood of Saints, the Guard now had more than enough munition and equipment to conquer this world twice over. When combined with what was left of the PDF after the mandatory purge, which was a given when you consider that the locals were tight with the Tau, the IG had the numbers too. There was just one little snag. The strike cruiser wasn't likely to let the equipment get down here in one piece unless the bloody idiotic mess between the Guard and the Astrates was resolved. We spent the rest of the ride in silence, something that gave me a time to think. I was idly staring through one of the side gun ports, marveling at the city around us. The place was no hive, just a handful of ornate, tall buildings, with the rest sprawling all around us. It was eerie for someone like me, who could only remember a single hive city as the way people in the Empire lived. Most of the buildings, especially the older ones, were typical Imperial engineering. Tough things with as much ornamentation as there were thrones for. They were beautiful too, at least in my humble opinion. Then there was the newer construction. It was simply wrong, from the clashing color schemes to the rounded forms without any straight angles. It wasn't something most humans would ever consider building. I frowned. This world was supposed to have been under heavy Tau influence before General Alexander and company came to bring them back in the fold by shooting anyone who wasn't fast enough in decrying the Xenos. At least I didn't have to deal with the Adepta Sororitas. The few I had the misfortune to meet simply creeped me out, even if they were otherwise stunning women. At least the pair I met back on Omicron. I returned my thoughts to the problem at hand and let out a mental sigh. I needed a plan, though most things that ran through my mind ended with my brain splattered over the nearest wall. Betting on the small amount of authority that Lord Requista's missive gave me might have worked, if the General Alexander was the one being antagonistic, and if he suddenly decided to act reasonable after seeing the data slate. Nothing short of a direct inquisitorial order was going to make the Astrates even listen. Fuck it. I would have to wing it after listening about the situation firsthand. That was always less than ideal. Soon we started hitting checkpoints, but thanks to Lacroix's written orders and my sigil, we were waved through after a cursory look in the troop compartment. No one sensible wanted to piss off anyone even tangentially connected with the Inquisition. Doing so usually was hazardous for the health. Eventually we reached the main guard base in the city, which had taken over a rather large park. On entering the base, we were actually properly inspected, and once the guards were reasonably sure that we weren't a bunch of Eldar masquerading like good men, let in. The former park was turned into barracks, motor pools, ammo depots and gunship landing pads, while its surrounding area was fortified with bunkers, trenches, prefab walls, good old-fashioned barbed wire, and a lot of weapon emplacements. The liberal dispersal of various mines on the likely approaches went without saying. I could see whole companies drilling, while cogheads were blessing at least a battalion worth of armor. Most of the tanks were the good old Lehman Russ, though I could see 3 huge Baneblades in the center of the formation. It was certainly impressive. I had to make sure that our good friends in the Adeptus Astrates didn't come here to turn all this splendid equipment into so much scrap. The Chimera parked in front of a bunker's entrance, one that was guarded by a squad of stormtroopers. It was time to face the music. A few checkpoints later, I was led into the command center, where General Alexander and his officers were looking over a map of the region. "General, sir," the inquisitorial agent as ordered. Lacroix saluted. "Good job, soldier. Go get something warm to eat." The general rumbled. He turned towards me, revealing a face weathered by the elements. "We have a problem, agent, one I hope you can fix." "I'm all ears, sir." "The Emperor's Adeptus Astartes have issued a purge of Kronus and ordered us to withdraw. They have already engaged my troops, massacring them on 3 separate occasions." He glared at me as if all this was my fault. "I already have standing orders from Segmentum Command. This world must be secured or we will die trying. I would rather avoid the latter." Oh my. I might get to like the man. I agreed wholeheartedly with the not dying idea. "You want me to convince the Astrates not to kill us all?" I went to the heart of the matter. The general winced but nodded. The other officers gave me a dirty looks instead. "And I'm ready to talk with whoever's in charge over there, though I don't know how much good it would do. I'm not an inquisitor." I shrugged. "I was afraid of that. I would like you to do your best. The lives of everyone here might depend on that." Well, shit. The way the general was approaching me meant that the situation was more fucked up than his succinct summary implied. Great. Well, if someone would be good enough to patch me to the Space Marines, I hope you have a communications line open with them despite the ongoing unpleasantries. More dirty looks. "Lieutenant Williams, patch the agent." A minute later, I was facing a small green-tinted screen. It showed an Adeptus Astrates helmet. "This is Brother Sergeant Coleman. Are you ready to depart Kronus?" "My lord." I gave a proper bow. "This is Delcatar Vale, agent of the Holy Inquisition. May I inquire what's the reason for the conflict between the Emperor's Space Marines and the Imperial Guard on Kronus?" I asked politely. For a long moment, the super soldier stared at me. "We have orders by our chapter master to purge Kronus. So far, we've been rather accommodating to the locals and the Imperial Guard. That won't be the case for much longer. We have to do our duty." "My lord, I believe you're aware that General Alexander and his troops are under orders by the Segmentum Command. To retreat, even if the God Emperor's Adeptus Astrates demand, it would be an act of treason. That's regrettable. The sergeant didn't appear to be moved at all. It was worth a shot anyway. What would it take for you to call off the purge at least until the conflicting orders are cleared up by higher authority? I asked. Order by the chapter master or someone with equal authority. Would inquisitorial order do? It might be enough for the force commander to consider ceasefire. Coleman nodded. May I make two suggestions, both to the Adeptus Astrates and you, General Alexander? I asked carefully. I'm listening. The officer spoke clearly. I'll entertain you in view of the organization you represent. Coleman's voice was toneless, showing no emotion. As I understand the situation, there are 3 Xeno factions currently operating on Kronus, Tau, Eldar, and most recently Orcs. Correct. The Space Marine just stared at me through the screen. Then may I suggest that you concentrate all purging efforts against them for the next few days? The same goes for the Imperial Guards. That's our duty. Alexander sounded eager. What would that accomplish? Coleman wasn't buying it. Not kill loyal Imperial citizens while I go and retrieve Inquisitor Requista. That's my second request. I would want an escort from the Imperial Guard to achieve that objective. I most humbly request that one Space Marine accompany us so he can witness whatever decision the Lord Inquisitor makes and immediately inform his battle brothers of it. I believe that such course of action would benefit the Empire the best. I'll bring this request to Captain Thule. Coleman cut off the connection. Do you think that this stunt will work? The general asked. At worst, it might buy your men a bit of breathing space. Sir, are you willing to provide me with escort and transport to the Deimos Peninsula? If it stops the Astrates from shooting my boys and girls even for a few days, I'll do it gladly. What do you need? I'd prefer a mech platoon and at least a squad of stormtroopers. Whatever Lord Requista ran into has to be nasty, or he would have been in contact by now. I'll see what we can spare. Now the ball was in Captain Thule's hands. 2 Chapter 1, Parts 4 and 5. A Tale of Blood and Steel, Chapter 1, Welcome to the Inquisition. Part 4, Imperial Guard Base, Final Liberation. Victory Bay, Kronus. Normally I'd laugh at such a request. Captain Lennox sounded rather irritated over the Vox. After the Astartes cruiser threatened to blow my ship to pieces for no good reason, I'm inclined to agree. Sent your message, and our astropath will transmit it. Do you have any particular destination in mind? The nearest naval base with request to make it available immediately to the Inquisition? As well as Segmentum Command, I asked. That might work. My station strikes again. Someone actually experienced and higher up on the food chain would know where to send such a message as mine, so it would light a fire under people's feet. Priority transmission to Segmentum Command and the nearest naval units to the Zeus system, Lythesh Sector. Imperial Guard units and Adeptus Astartes. Blood Ravens in open warfare on the surface. Reason, conflicting orders from Segmentum Command and Astartes Chapter Master. Higher authority intervention needed to resolve the conflict. Inquisitor Requista has been out of contact for a week, investigating heretic activity on the Deimos Peninsula. Status unknown, will investigate Xeno presence confirmed on Kronus, Eldar, Tau, and Orc. Requesting clarification of orders, inquisitorial support, and additional reinforcements. Inquisitorial Agent Delcatar Vale, identification. I hope that works. If it wasn't for Inquisitor Requista's orders to send you that message, the Astartes cruiser would have kept jamming our comms and prevented us from contacting the Blood of Saints just as it continued doing after you left the ship. General Alexander, who had been keeping an ear for my message, grumbled once I was done. It's like they aren't particularly keen on betting that their orders might be countermanded. I must. Any idea what has the noble Astartes ready to murder us all along with the Xenos? I asked. Not sure. One of our scout teams reported finding some kind of relics before we lost contact. When I sent a mech company to investigate, they were butchered by the Space Marines. Alexander looked positively murderous as he relied that little tidbit. Well, I hope they would enjoy the Ordo's investigation on their activities. Alexander smirked at that. I can give you a short platoon, 5 chimeras, and a handful of stormtroopers. I hope that will be enough. Me too. Whatever is responsible for Lord Requista being out of contact that long has to be nasty. Thank you for the support, General. Do you have any idea where exactly in Deimos Peninsula Lord Requista went? Unfortunately, no. He kept his own counsel. That was suboptimal. It was time to bite the bullet again. Would it be possible for someone to guide me to his quarters? There might be some pointers. I can't decide if you're very brave or foolish. The General raised an eyebrow at me. Try desperate. I know I could be shot when we find the Inquisitor, though the alternatives aren't much better. I'll see to it. A few stormtroopers who ran errands for the Inquisitor are around the base. I'll assign them to you. They know where he stayed in the city. Alexander gave me a sharp nod and returned to planning on how to deal with the myriad of enemies besieging Kronus. That in itself was curious. It would have actually been safer and lower profile if Requista had stayed in the base, and requisitioning barracks for only him and his retinue would have been a child's play. When the General said move, the IG usually does so with a gusto. At least the 1st Kronus Regiment, the Liberators as they were now known, did so. Just a few minutes after I sent the message that hopefully would get this mess sorted out if I failed in retrieving Requista in one piece, I was standing in front of the CP, where the promised chimeras were already waiting. Their lieutenant, one Felicia Picos, was standing at parade rest, flanked by 2 grizzled NCOs. Behind them, a trio of stormtroopers clad in an armor that looked much more advanced than the carapace every guardsman on Kronus seemed to wear, were lounging on the middle APC. Sir, 3rd Platoon, Alpha Company, 56th Battalion, 1st Kronus Regiment, reporting for duty. The woman saluted, speaking with the voice of a drill instructor. She had the bearing of one, too, reminding me for the people who handled some of our training in the Shkola. She was likely a promoted NCO, which meant that Picos knew what the hell she was doing. I gave her a reassuring smile. My chances for survival just jumped up a bit. Splendid. Are you familiar with the Deimos Peninsula, Lieutenant? I asked. Only by map, sir. We'll be going there to find a missing Inquisitor and his retinue. That earned me a long-suffered look, so I wasn't the only one to suspect that Requista might have chewed up more than he could handle. What's your plan, sir? Find if someone can narrow down where exactly Inquisitor Requista went, and failing that, just head into the peninsula and start asking pointed questions. I smiled thinly. I would be getting answers one way or another. I turned my attention to the stormtroopers. Soldiers, I understand that you did a few odd jobs for the Lord Inquisitor and know where he stayed in the city. That's right. The apparent leader of the group nodded and stood straighter. We'll be going there while waiting for the Astartes to make up their minds. About what, sir? The lieutenant asked. If it isn't too much to ask, sir, she hastily added. If they will accept my suggestion to concentrate their efforts on the Xeno, instead of trying to kill us as well, at least until we can locate the Inquisitor so he can straighten up this mess. The troopers in earshot perked up at that. Ah, I hope they will. Picos nodded. Right now, I was following the advice of First Sergeant Nolan, who was the latest NCO handling my CQB training in the Shkola. He was on the opinion that it was always prudent to make sure that the average IG trooper has at least a few reasons to keep you alive. Doing your best to prevent Spake Marines from murdering them all fell square in that category, I think. According to Nolan, such little things increased the likelihood of the troopers actually trying to save me when I was in a scrap and decreased the chance of getting accidentally shot in the back. Multiple times. Your name, trooper? I asked the stormtrooper who addressed me. Corporal Santos, sir. You and your 2 friends will act as my bodyguards until we get the job done. Do you have any idea where the Inquisitor headed to? Negative, sir. Then we're going to check up his quarters for clues. On my authority, so don't worry about getting shot if he disapproves. Where is he staying anyway? Elysium District, to the southwest of here. Lieutenant, I trust there won't be any problem getting there now, I asked. Not that I know of, sir. Let's get going. Part 5, Diomedes Residential Complex, Elysium District, Victory Bay. In hindsight, my idea turned out to be suboptimal. The heavy-armed and armored servitors that had us pinned in the end of the corridor made that point very clear. "Sir, you could have warned us about them," Santos shouted over the roar of bolter rounds disintegrating the corridor leading to Requista's quarters. "Throw a crack grenade or two downrange," I snapped back. Everything started so well too. First, Captain Thule had agreed to be somewhat reasonable and informed us that he would send a space marine to meet us on the main route leading to Deimos. He would also try not to annihilate any more guard companies while we searched for Requista, though he didn't make any firm promises on that point. Getting to the district where the Inquisitor was staying went without a hitch too. It was quite enjoyable too. This place had parks, with actual real trees and plants. It's so damned green and bloody awesome. It was the first time I remember being this close to live plants, you know. Thanks to the view, I was in a rather high spirits when we reached the 10-story residential building where Requista had made his lair. The stormtrooper obeyed and retrieved the grenades from his harness. In the meantime, I concentrated, opening my mind to the warp. Touching it was as exhilarating as ever, yet it made me flinch. It felt even nastier and more turbulent than few hours ago. Whatever was affecting it, so wasn't good news. With an ugly snarl, I fueled myself with the warp's tainted power, channeling and shaping it. Purple energies coiled around my left hand, manifesting in the form of lighting. Allowing the immaterium to enhance my senses, I let my mind expand until I knew where exactly the combat servitors were standing. I gave a sharp nod to Santos and moved faster than an ordinary human had any right to be. My hand leaned over the corner behind which we were hiding, and I released the warp craft I had prepared. That was followed by the corporal throwing the grenades. The eldritch bolt slammed into the chassis of the closest servitor, caving in the armor as if it was a tissue paper, before hitting something important. I could feel the former man freeze in its tracks before the cracks hit, bathing the corridor in fire and shrapnel. The overpressure wave slammed into us next, though my warp-enhanced body and the stormtrooper's armor kept us intact. I didn't release my connection with the immaterium until I was reasonably sure that both combat servitors were disabled. "I think that they're done. Check carefully and shoot them a few times to make sure." I grunted and gently let go of my connection with the warp, while quietly reciting prayers to the Emperor. The power reluctantly left me, leaving me weaker and hungry for more. There was something damn wrong with the warp, and considering what exactly it was at the best of times, that was saying something. I finished my prayer, while Valencia and Dole, the other two stormtroopers, gleefully shot to pieces what was left from the servitors. The latter wasn't something I was going to mention to any coghead. They tended to be peeved off and downright murderous about such things. Strange people. I shook my head, trying to concentrate on the task at hand. That was usually hard just after I had stopped channeling the warp. My mind kept jumping to odd places or the desire to open myself for more power. It was a distracting issue, one that I was taught should be mitigated as I gained more experience, and until then I should be praying for the Emperor's protection and hope for the best. Or so my instructors taught me. It was too bad that the Emperor was undoubtedly too busy dealing with much bigger issues than one poor novice psyker who was liable to get killed while distracted. "It's clear, sir," Santos shouted from down the corridor. I leaned over the corner and winced. The place was torn to shreds from bolter and laser fire even before the rather energetic way we ended the firefight. Good. Now let's see what other surprises the Lord Inquisitor had left us. "You first, sir. You have a better chance of dealing with whatever awaits us in there." Santos's voice lacked any emotion. "Don't worry, I won't be using you as bait for any traps. That would be a waste." Were those sighs of relief I heard? I shrugged and carefully avoided the smouldering remains of the servitors. Getting almost killed was my fault. I should have known better. It was a no-brainer that an Inquisitor would have defenses protecting their quarters. When I first saw the combat servitors, humans turned into 2-meter-tall murderous cyborgs with cogitators for brains, I was overconfident. So far, my sigil had been sufficient to get me through most everything I faced. Besides, it had a lot of codes buried within it, so I could be identified for who I was. That's why I presented it to be scanned with no care in the world. Codes not recognized, intruders detected. Those words chilled my blood. Back, I shouted, and at the same time disregarded most of what I was taught about safely touching the warp. I sprang through my mental defenses and plunged my mind in the immaterium. The raw power made me feel giddy. Like a god among men, the tainted energies ran through my body at the speed of thought, enhancing me beyond what was usually possible for a human. Inquisitorial sigil detected. Error. Engaging intruders. The weapons of the servitors were already aiming at me when I channeled the warp into a blunt wave of physical force that threw them off their feet. That didn't stop them from opening fire with built-in laser guns, though it fortunately threw off the aim of the rather large bolters they had built into their arms. I wasted no time, turned tail and sprinted down the corridor, hoping that my carapace would be up to the task. I stumbled as my back was hit, but continued running. I was almost at the end when searing pain lanced over my right hand. Another blast caught me in the back, and this time sent me flailing on the floor. Before the combat servitors could blast me to pieces, a strong hand pulled me behind the corner. Not a moment too soon, because a second later my former position was torn apart by bolter fire. I winced. That had been particularly dumb and overconfident thing to do. My body shook as the adrenaline that had flooded me at the start of the firefight started draining out. Just great. My first time out working, and I almost got myself and the stormtroopers killed. Not a nice start at all. Not to mention that if I wasn't enhanced by the warp at the time, that shot would have blasted off my arm instead of letting me get off with only a nasty burn. A few deep breaths and a calming mental exercise later, I had centered myself. Somewhat. This time I accessed the warp properly, which meant very, very carefully. Its tainted power washed over me, invigorating my body. I closed my eyes, letting my mind wander forward into Requista's quarters. I could sense no more servitors, though there was something blessed, which shone hard enough in the warp that it prevented me from perceiving anything past the corridor leading deeper in the apartment. I pulled out my chainsword, brought it to screaming life, and tore apart the battered, heavy wooden doors that were in my way. Splinters flew in all directions as the obstacle disintegrated under my strikes. Once I had the doors done for, I looked inside. Even the small corridor I could see was quite opulent. Expensive rugs over marble, walls covered with wooden paneling and paintings. The place looked fit for a noble. Apparently Requista liked his creature comforts. Can't say I blame him, really. A warp blast, similar to what I used to disable one of the servitors, obliterated the next door from a safe distance. That turned out to be simple paranoia because no further attackers materialized. No traps were triggered either, but after my earlier mishap, I was suddenly a firm believer in the better safe than messily dead school of thought. I went through the blasted door, ready to jump back in the corridor and run like hell if needed. I found myself in a large living room, furnished richly and tastefully enough that most nobles would be hard-pressed to find a reason to complain, though that was less than helpful in this situation. Until I laid my eyes on a large table surrounded by intricately carved stools. It had an old-fashioned paper map strewn over it. I walked there and looked it over. Sure enough, it depicted the Deimos Peninsula, though there weren't any helpful markings showing where Requista went. Fortunately, I wasn't limited to what was visible to the naked eye. Looking at the map through the prism of the warp was different. There were spots that psychically resonated, though I lacked a certain context, a point from which to attack the problem. I needed an item belonging to Requista, one on which his presence had been imprinted. I drew back, leaving only a tiny connection between my mind and the warp, and looked around. The most likely place I would find something was the room where I could sense the relic. But that was also the last one I was going to check. I was sure that there were additional protections around it. Luckily, I didn't need to go in there. In the dining room, I found a crimson cloak lying discarded on a chair. It had the stylized symbol of the Inquisition embodied on it, though nothing else special I could feel. No protective runes or anything like that. That was actually great. No one but an Inquisitor would dare wear such an article of clothing. I went next to the cloak and touched it, focusing on it through the warp. My head was starting to throb already, but I got what I needed. The world around me shattered, the warp clawing at my mind. A blurry image appeared. A man, a bit taller than myself, Middle-aged, graying and receding short hair, scarred face with bionic eye shining in the night. Just looking at him, you'd simply disregard him like someone unimportant, unimpressive, something that served him well. He looked at me and the vision shattered. I stumbled back and groaned. My head was killing me. What was to follow was going to be really unpleasant. The state of the warp around here made even the relatively simple things exhausting and painful, even if it freely offered more power than I could comfortably handle at the best of days. The very act of touching it was the greatest power trip ever, combined with walking through the sewers of a wretched hive city. I returned to the map, all the while muttering prayers to the Emperor. Now that I was familiar with Requista's psychic signature, I had something to work with. I went deeper into the warp. Disregarding the whispering voices in the back of my head, I concentrated on the places on the map that had the strongest emotional imprint. Requista was leaning over the table, speaking to someone I couldn't see. I couldn't hear his words, they were unintelligible whispers, though I could see where he was pointing. He shook his head and moved his finger towards the mountains in the middle of the peninsula. His tone became more insistent. His face twisted into a grimace. My vision became blurry, then turned red. My head felt like it was about to explode. The warp around me was getting even more restless, if that was even possible. I could feel something skittering. It was hissing hungrily and getting closer. It took all my remaining willpower to tear myself away and plunge back firmly into my body. My trembling lips were busy muttering litanies of protection against chaos. I didn't know how close that thing came to attacking me, whatever the cursed warp spawn was, but it was too close for comfort. I felt something wet sliding down my cheeks and brushed it with a finger before looking at it. It was blood. Fuck, I groaned. Sir, are you all right? Santos's voice was wary, on edge. I'll live. That was too close to comfort. I whispered in a tired voice. At least I know where the Inquisitor went. We need to go. And call the medic. He should look me over. I almost melted my damn brain. That didn't reassure the stormtroopers. When I looked up at them, they were pointing their hotshots at me. 3, Chapter 1, Parts 6 and 7. A Tale of Blood and Steel. Chapter 1, Welcome to the Inquisition. Part 6, Diomedes Residential Complex, Elysium District, Victory Bay. Boys, if I was going to suddenly turn into a demon, I would have done it already. In that case, you should have started shooting a minute or so ago. I deadpanned and brushed off the blood on my face. Besides, is this the thanks I get for risking my very soul in order to help you guys? I glared at them. How is this helping us? Santos waved at me with his gun. You're well aware what the Astartes would do once their patience runs out, right? The sooner we find the Inquisitor, the less of your buddies will die. I didn't add that we might not find him in a state to help anyone but the Emperor. Corporal, he actually makes sense, Dole muttered. Yeah, but the Inquisitor get the rest of our squad killed when he sent us after that Eldar, Valencia added. I should have asked what exactly did the stormtroopers did for Requista before requesting them as my bodyguards. I made a mental note to seek such information in the future if I got out of this snag alive. He's right, though. If someone doesn't talk some sense to the Marines, we're fucked like Slaaneshi cultists after an orgy. Dole nodded sagely. How do you know that? I asked pointedly. We had to clean up that nest of cultists on Bendix's world before we deployed here. I could clear the disgust in Santos's voice clearly. Yep, nasty stuff. Valencia nodded. You're lucky that I'm not a paranoid member of the Ordo Hereticus. I sighed. Are you going to shoot me, or can we go? I could really use some painkillers right now. What do you think, boss? Valencia asked. Well, he isn't growing tentacles or extra limbs. Besides, he sounds sane. Saner than most of our commanders before we got assigned to General Alexander's regiment, Dole added. So the Sarge was right. Showing that you care about the lives of the troops could save your life, unless they were going to shoot me anyway. I wondered if I could channel enough warp energy to save myself before my head blew up, because it already felt as if Titans were marching through it. I had no illusions that I could draw my last pistol and shoot before being gunned down, much less use my chainsword. Perhaps now it wasn't the best moment to mention what might happen if I fucked up using the warp to save myself. Such an explanation was all but guaranteed to get me shot just in case. "Let's go see the medic, sir. You look like shit." Santos lowered his weapon and his men followed suit. "I feel worse. Thanks for not using me for target practice." "Days still young." Valencia snorted. "St. Hortensia's Highway, Deimos Peninsula." We left a squad to secure Requista's apartment and calm down the locals. The medic started checking me up after we piled up in the Chimera and went on our way to meet the Astartes. Some painkillers, a bandage, and an order to try and get a bit of rest was his conclusion. While he couldn't find anything permanently wrong with me, the medic didn't have the equipment at hand for any in-depth scans, so I had to hope for the best. The rest, on the other hand, was out of the question once we neared our destination. Even without the warp feeling particularly hellish and pissed off here, I would still be racing to find Requista anyway. With the Immaterium's state, that just became even more important. Still, there wasn't a thing stopping me from getting a nap while we drove through the countryside. I did sleep, dreaming of dark, formless shapes. It didn't do much to rejuvenate me before Santos shook me awake, earning himself a bleary-eyed glare. "The Astartes is in sight, sir. We'll reach him in a few minutes." I gave him a nod and stretched, cursing the lack of CAF on the Chimeras. That should be a vital feature for the functioning of the troops. Then I looked outside through the nearest gun slit. There were fields all around us, covered by a blanket of waving yellow plants. Something to do with feeding the local populace, no doubt. I could see a handful of people and machines tending them, though not near enough I would expect. A five-cornered war might give the locals other things to worry about beside the harvest, no matter how important it might be. Considering that the fields around Victory Bay were starting to resemble a lunar landscape because of the constant skirmishes between the Guard, Tau, Orc probing attacks, and Eldar incursions, that might turn out to be a problem long-term. As we got nearer, I dared take a peek at the Marine waiting us through the warp and recoiled back. He was the strongest presence in the Immaterium I had yet to meet. I frowned. That very thought sounded somewhat wrong in my head. The convoy ground to a halt when we reached the Astartes. It was time to meet him and see if he was going to be actually helpful. I was first out once the ramp lowered and headed towards the large warp presence. Damn, he was big, more like really huge. He was an armored behemoth at least a head over 2 meters tall, clad in a pristine power armor that was covered with purity seals, which shone in the warp with the power of the blessing they carried. He was leaning on a large assault bike, which had built in a pair of autocannons. A golden-plated warhammer could be seen sticking out of a side compartment of his ride. "Welcome, I'm Brother Librarian Antius." The Astartes turned his helmet my way. His voice boomed, carrying over the nearby fields. "My lord," I bowed, and the lieutenant, who joined us, then followed my example. What the hell was a librarian doing out here by himself? "So you're the one that made Thule listen to reason." Anti studied me for a moment. "I expected you to be taller." I just stared at the super soldier. Did he just make a joke? Then his first words hit me. So not everyone in the Blood Ravens was totally on board with slaughtering loyal Imperial citizens because of conflicting orders. That was good to know. "Now, do you know where we should start seeking the Inquisitor? We should retrieve him before the captain gets impatient again." "Ah, yes, my lord. I scried his destination from a map in his quarters." "Good, good. You've noticed the state of the warp, then?" the librarian asked. "It's the nastiest I've ever felt." I told him the truth, yet those words rang hollow too. I had the feeling that I've experienced even nastier parts of the Immaterium, though I couldn't recall it. It's quite unpleasant, isn't it? It heralds nothing good for any of us. We should hurry with finding Requista. With those words, he turned around and got on his bike. "Let's go find the Inquisitor." I nodded to Picos, who was staring at the librarian. I think that the Astartes joking broke her, and it was something I was still trying to wrap my head around. Part 7. Stonecutter Village, Deimos Peninsula. Kronus. A few hours later, we reached a small settlement nestled in a valley below the plateau, dominating the southern part of the peninsula. Through it laid the most direct and fastest land route to our target. It was a good place to ask a few questions of the locals. First, I needed to know if the Inquisitor had passed through here, and as important, to figure out what was he seeking in this part of Kronus. So far, Deimos and the surrounding provinces were mostly untouched by the war, save for the occasional orcish raid. That was the plan anyway. It hit a snag before we even parked in the small square that served as a center for the village. One would expect to find a lot of onlookers when a platoon of Imperial guardsmen accompanied by an Astrates arrive at their doorstep. That would have been normal. There was not a single person outside when we parked in the plaza. "It's too quiet, sir," Santos muttered quietly. The corporal was carefully studying the surrounding buildings through a gun port. That's probably the first time outside of an active war zone that I don't see bystanders gawking at us. The Space Marine by himself would guarantee that everyone who could would be outside looking. Or running for the hills. In either case, we would have heard or saw someone. Valencia added, "Weapons on the ready." I spoke quietly and drew my pistol. My right hand fell on the hilt of my sword. We weren't the only ones to smell trouble. The rest of the guardsmen dispersed immediately after leaving the chimeras and got under whatever cover they could. The only one who stood seemingly without a trouble in the world was the librarian, though he had pulled his warhammer out of its compartment. I sighed and concentrated before carefully touching the warp. There were echoes of pain and terror. An odd feeling that resembled death, but not quite. Yet they both felt somewhat subdued. There were no living people here beside us that I could sense, though that was no guarantee. I had to pull back from the warp as my head started pounding almost immediately. The immaterium felt eager, almost hungry, as if it was holding its breath while it was waiting for something. That wasn't a nice sensation at all. "This settlement is empty." Antius' voice was quieter, merely the volume of a rather loud man. "Lieutenant sent a few squads to check the nearby buildings. Men, don't leave your buddies out of your sight. There's something very wrong here," I added. The last I spoke quietly so they won't hear it. Thad didn't help with the librarian who inclined his head in my direction. "Walk with me. We'll check the chapel," Antius ordered. I shrugged and walked fast after him. At least he took care to walk reasonably slowly so we wouldn't need to run after him to keep up. The stormtroopers fell in behind me and I saw the lieutenant wave a squad to follow us. She and 2 fire teams remained with the vehicles, while the rest of the platoon moved toward the nearest buildings. "Aren't you curious?" the Astartes asked when we caught up with him. "About what, my lord?" His helmeted head swiveled my way and he gave me a pointed look. I didn't know that a Space Marine helmet could convey so much. Truth to be told, yes. At best, I expected your captain to send the lowest-ranked Astartes under his command. Instead, we got you, my lord. Unless I'm very much mistaken, your armor and all the seals on it signify that you aren't just any odd Bloodraven librarian, which is even more surprising. Makes no damn sense, you mean? Was that amusement I could hear in his voice? I shrugged. It didn't. That was Thule's plan, you know, to send you a pair of scout marines who are due for punishment detail. I nodded. That was much more likely. I disagreed. Finding Requista is the most expedient way to stop this madness. Antius sighed. Unfortunately, the captain doesn't believe him to be alive any longer. Not after being out of contact for a week now. That very well may be the case, though I had to take the chance. The alternative. The Inquisition and Segmentum Command won't be thrilled when they learn about what has already happened. Any more skirmishes between Imperial forces for no good reason would be frowned upon at best. Indeed. Unfortunately, our orders don't leave much for interpretation, and Captain Thule isn't prepared to breach them, even if it mean evicting the Imperial guards from Kronus. I guess that a strongly worded suggestion from an Inquisitor would give the captain the latitude he needs so we can concentrate on dealing with the Xenos. That's why I'm here. There are some of us that would take any chance to avoid spilling innocent human blood. The librarian spoke quietly. We were about to reach the chapel. It was only a short alley away, one which was flanked by statues of Imperial saints. Acting out of habit, I made the sigh of the Aquila and bowed my head. "Do you smell that?" Dole asked. I could hear him sniffing behind me. A light wind blew towards us from the direction of the chapel, and I could barely make out the scent too. It was the coppery stench of blood, and it had to be an awful lot of it if we could smell from our position. Set up to provide cover, I snapped at the guardsman following us. Santos, prepare to breach. Check for traps first. No need, I'll lead the way. The Astartes rumbled and strode towards the chapel. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who was fine with forced entry today. The Astartes pressed a rune on the hilt of his weapon, and pale lighting started dancing around its head. He swung the warhammer as if it was a toy and simply shattered the door standing in his way. The afternoon sun shone through the entrance, bathing the interior of the chapel in its rays. "Fuck me with a baneblade," Santos exclaimed. He was the first of us ordinary humans to see what was inside, thanks to the tech built into his helmet. Antaeus was busy muttering a prayer for the dead, though his head was swiveling this way and that as he studied the interior of the chapel. That's when I was finally able to see what awaited us inside. The place resembled an old battlefield. The floor was covered with shattered and burned wood, though it was hard to make under the film of blood covering most of it. The walls were liberally sprayed with dry, flaking blood, though I could see deep gashes in the stone where great claws had cleaved it without any trouble at all. There were no bodies, or even pieces of such, though there was more than enough blood spilled to account for at least a couple of dozen people. "May the Emperor damn whoever did this," I hissed. I closed my eyes and opened my mind to the warp, while steeling myself for what was to come. The echoes of pain, suffering, and terror were still here, though muted again, as if whatever had happened was hundreds of years ago at least, and not in the last few days. It made no damned sense. My head should be splitting from the screams of the dying. I should be feeling the psychic imprint of their souls as they were murdered. "Curious, isn't it?" A deep voice boomed in my head. Suddenly, there was a figure wreathed in light towering next to me. It was Antaeus, all right. His very soul shone with its purity and power. "That's not how I would put this." I waved around us. While the warp continued to be wild and angry around us, the librarian's presence next to me made it bearable. My head did hurt a bit, but nowhere near what I expected. What didn't change was the feeling of foreboding, of eager expectation for something to happen. It wasn't going to be anything good for us. "No, there's something afoot in this place, something familiar." Antaeus frowned. "I can't sense what did this." He waved at the bloody floor. "There should be something, an imprint, a resonance left from whoever did it." "It's as if they had no presence in the warp," I muttered. "Exactly," the librarian exclaimed. "That would account for the way the murders feel. Blanks, perhaps. This at least isn't the work of chaos. We would have known it at first sight. Considering that the Inquisitor came here to seek heretics, this isn't reassuring. The last thing we need is another enemy." "True. There isn't anything more we could find out right now." The shining presence next to me became muted as Antaeus pulled out of the warp. I was back firmly in my body moments later, still feeling the after effects of my little excursion. "Don't give me that. I want you to check all reports of vanished people and see if there are any other settlements we've lost contact with without a good reason." Antaeus was speaking aloud over the vox built in his helmet. It was a good idea. I would have Lieutenant Picos report back to base so they could check too. 4. Chapter 1, Parts 8 to 9. A Tale of Blood and Steel. Chapter 1, Welcome to the Inquisition. Part 8, Stonecutter Village, Deimos Peninsula, Kronus. The search squads found a few similar sites where people had barricaded themselves, to no avail. Neither prayer, stubs, or the few ruined lasguns we found had helped the poor bastards. Sir General Alexander requested that we investigate further while we search for the Lord Inquisitor, Lieutenant Picos said after coming out of the command chimera. "That's a given." I sighed, as if we didn't have enough problems already. "There's another village at the other end of the valley. The main route to the plateau passes through it." I jumped, hearing a deep voice behind me. I whirled around with an angry retort on the tip of my tongue and then froze. The librarian was towering over me, casually leaning on his warhammer. How the hell did someone so big and clad in at least half a ton of armor move so quietly, damn it? "You need to keep better situational awareness," Antaeus chided me. He was amused at my reactions, the cheeky bastard. Why the hell did I have to land myself the only space marine with a sense of humor? I'll keep that in mind, my lord. Good. It would be a pity if you got yourself killed because you didn't pay attention. As I was saying, there's another settlement on our way. It might be our best bet for gathering some useful information. If there was anyone still alive, there was left unsaid. It's not like we have much of a choice, I muttered. No, sir. The Tau are mounting a major offensive to regain the plains leading to Victory Bay. General Alexander can't spare any more units right now. The same is true for the Blood Ravens. A large orc horde is approaching our main base of operations. Unless we hit something very nasty, we won't be getting any support, perhaps even then depending on the situation on the ground. There are 3 squads ready for orbital insertion, though the front line has priority. Even a single Astartes squad should be more than enough to deal with whatever we find. The lieutenant perked up. I face-palmed. You had to say that, I groaned. Antes just stared at the LT and shook his head. What? It's Astartes we're talking about. People like him. She pointed at the librarian. That's it. We're all dead. I moaned. We still might get lucky, at least a few of us. Antaeus nodded sagely. Few days after the last time I heard such a thing, we were neck-deep in orcs. We've checked the whole village, right? Alpha and Beta squads are checking a few houses on the outskirts, and we're done. The LT nodded. Unless they find something of note, we're leaving when they finish. Yes, I feel that our time is running out, Antaeus stated. That wasn't what I wanted or needed to hear. Any news about unexplained disappearances or settlements out of contact without a reasonable explanation? I asked. A lot of people had vanished near the desert further in the mainland, though that may be due to the Tau or Orc bands. We've lost contact with more than a few towns and villages there, though with all the Xeno activity in the region, that didn't raise an eyebrow back at HQ. It might be the usual suspects. Picos shrugged. Until we can send a unit there to check, all we've got is guesses. We need to find the Inquisitor and end this nonsense. We have more than enough problems without killing each other, I snapped. That's why I'm here. Antaeus sighed. Unfortunately, most of my company would rather follow our orders and purge everyone off this planet. Genova Town, Deimos Peninsula, Kronus. At least the region wasn't completely deserted. About 10 kilometers from the village, we started seeing people tending the fields surrounding the road. It was reassuring after the bloodbath we found. Even better, there were no accidents or anything else to slow us down. We reached the town about an hour after sunset. This place was a stark contrast to Stonecutter. Genova was lit up so we could see it long before we actually approached. The town was much bigger than the small settlement that got massacred, and perhaps that's what saved. Or it was simply a matter of distance from the base of whatever did the slaughtering. Genova had its inhabitants present too. We could see small groups of the locals clustered on street corners, talking or simply minding their own business. They were staring and pointing at us, especially once they saw our space marine. The sight should have brought us a measure of relief. Instead, that's where the veneer of business as usual ended. I could see the faces and eyes of some of the people, those staying close enough to streetlights. They weren't happy to see us, or even concerned. No, a lot of them were plain terrified. That started ringing alarm bells in my head. If they were out of contact with the nearby settlements and had people vanishing, something that was likely they should have been overjoyed or at least relieved by our arrival. With the citizenry being anything but, well, that was problematic. I had the sneaking suspicion that we just found the nest of heretics Requista had been searching for. Look alive, people. This smells like trouble. I spoke. Santos, who had been watching the sights, nodded and voxed a warning to the rest of the platoon, just in case if they hadn't noticed. Despite the irregular behavior of the locals, we drove through the outskirts, heading for the town's center where the local arbiters and administration buildings were located. Our destination turned out to be a cross between a moderately sized plaza for a town of this caliber, crossed with a park. There were a few 10-story buildings to our right. The administrative and law enforcement centers for the whole peninsula were situated here, even if the biggest populated centers were 50 or so kilometers south of here, built over the far end of the plateau. When we arrived, we found a welcome committee waiting for us. There were 2 men in the robes of the administratum and a single coghead clad in the customary red who had 6 mechatendrils waving gently behind his back. Each of the artificial limbs ended into either a weapon or tool. A few steps behind the trio, we could see 2 rows of a dozen arbiters each. A couple of PDF squads were marching towards the waiting people from the left side of the plaza. From here, it looked like they had flak vests and laser guns. "I hope we would avoid a few hours of speeches and posturing," Santos muttered. "We'll just have to sick the librarian on them." I spoke cheerfully, though I couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. "It's time to face the music." I stood up and straightened up my clothes, though it didn't do much for my appearance under the carapace armor. I made sure that my sigil was visible around my left wrist and pressed the button opening the ramp. The rest of the platoon was already disembarking. The squads were taking defensive positions around the chimeras, not even trying to pretend that they were doing otherwise. The apparent leader of the trio ready to meet us just smiled at our blatant display of distrust and paranoia. It wasn't a nice smile either. I walked towards them, flanked by the stormtroopers. A few seconds later, Picos joined us, shadowed by a squad of her men. Antaeus finished up our procession when he took the right flank after retrieving his warhammer. The librarian's very presence should have been enough to ensure that any pissing match came to a rather abrupt and embarrassing end, if the locals were dumb enough to try. Instead, they were smiling at us as if they knew something we didn't. "Sir, look right," Santos muttered. My head snapped in that direction. There were a lot of civilians moving through the park and heading our way. Scores of them at least. "It's same here," Picos whispered from my left. That wasn't sinister at all. Nope. My hands fell over my weapons, ready to draw them at a moment's notice. It appeared that we found our heretics. I whispered a prayer and touched the warp, letting its energies course through me. I could feel the blazing presence of Antaeus next to me as he did the same. "You're supposed to run this little excursion, Vale. Let's see how you're going to play this." I could hear the librarian's voice in my head. While there was a bit of amusement in his tone, it couldn't hide the grim determination that practically oozed from the man. Then my perception washed over the waiting party. Their presence was wrong. I could feel the touch of the warp on their souls, and it felt revolting, like a festering wound and spilled blood. Yep, we found our heretics all right. I smiled at the bastards and took a step in front of my companions. "Inquisitor Requista. Where is he?" I wasted no time with pointless pleasantries. There was only one way this was going to end. The only question was if they would let slip what I needed to know before the fun started. "He's waiting for you." The administratum flunky, apparently in charge, inclined his head to the arbiter's building. "In what condition?" I growled. "He's been enjoying our hospitality for the past few days. You understand, right? We only did what we had to in order to prevent the Red Harvest." The man's smile sent cold shivers down my spine. "The Red Harvest?" Antaeus asked, making them flinch. "Yes. The soulless ones had risen, and only our new patrons can protect us. You're too late to stop it, just as predicted." The other flunky added, he had a shit-eating grin on his face. "We thought that an Inquisitor would made a splendid gift, but you're even better." "Gift to whom?" I asked in as hard voice as I could manage. "Our salvation and your doom. The ritual is already in progress. You're too late." The leader beamed at us. "I want that one alive," Antaeus ordered. His warhammer shone with energy as he activated its generator. I opened myself further to the warp and drew my weapons. The stench of sheer wrongness and corruption was increasing by the second. The waiting was over. Before anyone but Antaeus could react, I pointed my pistol and shot the expendable administratum official. In the same time, the librarian charged forward and did his best to take out the coghead, who in turn jumped back, revealing that under his robes he had 6 spider-esque metal legs. Then all hell broke loose. Part 9. Genova Town, Deimos Peninsula, Kronus. 2 more shots, and the remaining administratum flunky collapsed on the ground, screaming, with his kneecaps blown off. That left the arbiters as immediate threat, all 24 of them. Behind me, the platoon opened fire, which was drowned a moment later by the sharp bark of autocannons. With any luck and the Emperor's blessing, they would be able to handle the mob. The LT and her group were fanning out and joined the stormtroopers in keeping my rear safe and providing much-needed fire support. That didn't even slow down the heretical arbiters. They acted like automatons. With stiff, precise movements, the traitors unslung their riot shotguns, formed their backs, and chambered rounds. At least the maniacs didn't rush us. Instead, they simply moved in so they wouldn't shoot their friends. Their actions gave me plenty of time to shoot 2 of them in the head. The arbiter's faceplate proved to be insufficient barrier for my last pistol. The front of my target's heads turned into red mist, and they crumpled on the ground. Time moved sluggishly, or at least my enhanced reflexes made me perceive it so. That gave me a great view of the remaining arbiters as they raised their weapons and aimed them in my general direction. Picos and her guards were picking them off one after another, yet the death of their buddies didn't faze the rest. I let my last pistol go and drew as much of the warp's raging energies as I dared. Purple lighting surrounded me like a cloak as I let the excess power bleed of my body. My nerves lit up with pain as they were kissed by that corrupting caress of the warp, and I channeled all the energy dancing within and around me through my free hand, using the latter as a guide for its path. I waved in front of me and unleashed a stream of eldritch energy at the remaining arbiters. Those of them who were touched by the raw warp energy had the flesh stripped from their bones within moments, and the rest were thrown like ragdolls from the concussion wave. I stumbled back as I cut off my attack and dropped the amount of power I was channeling. My lips drew in a bloodthirsty smile as I surveyed my handiwork. At least 10 of the bastards were turned into twisted, smoldering skeletons. The remaining arbiters were dazzled, and most of them had lost hold of the riot shotguns. I didn't let them recover and charged, holding my trusty chainsword in a 2-handed grip. I gave a wordless battle cry and slammed my weapon into a heretic's neck, then pushed down. The adamantium teeth cut through armor, flesh, and bone as if it was made of butter, spraying me with blood and gore. It all felt glorious. The shouts of the men fighting around me were music to my ears. The agonized screams of the dying, it made me laugh as I cut down another heretic. Then there was the warm blood splashed over my face and mouth. It tasted like the best wine I'd ever tried. I slammed my sword into the gut of an arbiter who was just finding his footing and cut him in 2, spilling his guts on the ground, when something blasted me off my feet and broke my concentration, making me let go of the warp. That in turn drove me out of the blood-crazed haze I had fallen in. I just lay there for a few moments, staring at the blurry figures fighting in front of me. A giant clad in red armor was swinging a warhammer at a mechanical spider, while the machine was responding with laser beams and cutting torches. The former struck the larger combatant again and again for no visible effect, while the latter were evaded with startling ease. A familiar bearded face appeared in front of my eyes, cutting the view of the battle. "Vale, are you all right?" Valencia mouthed off, and I barely heard him. Huh. My ears were ringing, and I was noticing it just now. A strong hand grabbed my shoulder and shook me, and when that didn't remove the fog drifting through my mind, the Stormtrooper slapped me with his armored glove. That bloody hurt. "Valencia! The fuck?" I groaned and shook my head. He pulled me up, and I looked around. Ah, yeah. Fucking heretics were trying to sacrifice us to the Chaos Gods. Most of those in the immediate vicinity were either dead or busy dying, courtesy to Picos and her troopers. Only the corrupted coghead was still standing, and he was locked in combat with Antaeus. That wasn't something I wanted to get in between, but we didn't have time to let the librarian have fun. "Shoot the coghead," I rasped. Damn, my chest hurt like a mule had kicked me in the side. I glanced down. My carapace armor was dented, no mean feat. Whatever those shotguns were loaded with, it wasn't standard ammo. I glanced beyond the immediate area. The guardsmen were pouring all they could into a crowd of crazed people who were simply stumbling over their dead and coming closer and closer to us. That wasn't helped by the presence of a local PDF squad who had taken cover behind a nearby statue and was doing their best to suppress the platoon. Then they vanished in a flash of light as an autocannon hit them with a frag round. Good riddance to bad rubbish. I returned my attention to the Astartes just in time to see him catch the traitorous tech priest in the side with his power weapon. The Warhammer's head nearly cut the cyborg in half before it threw him nearly 10 meters away. A moment later, the heretic was followed by a frag grenade, which landed next to his head and blew up, shredding what little flesh he had left. "Santos, shoot him some more, just in case," I ordered. The stormtrooper wasted no time in complying and unleashed a hail of laser bolts at the cyborg, slagging parts of its chassis. Antaeus gave me a curt nod and turned around, then charged at the crowd, which was coming uncomfortably close to the chimeras, despite the torrent of fire that was scything their ranks. The librarian enhanced his attack with warp energy, and when he hit the heretics, it was unleashed. At least 15 mangled corpses were sent flying into the air when he hit the crowd. The Astartes waged into the maddened civilians and started smashing through them with his warhammer. "The left flank," Picos shouted, making me tear my eyes from the bloody spectacle. I looked in that direction and winced. Despite the best efforts of the guardsmen, the heretics were almost in arm's reach of our people. The LT sprinted that way, followed by her retinue and the stormtroopers. I grit my teeth, opened myself to the warp and followed suit. It was time to paint the ground red.